This video is about the final chapter of John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. To end the novel, he takes us back to where we began, the Salinas River. It's a terribly upsetting ending, but there are seeds of hope sown as well at the conclusion. Because it's the final chapter, this is a brilliant time to talk about some of Steinbeck's messages. The way a writer concludes a novel tells you about what they're really trying to convey to the reader, and we will do that in this video. We're going to look at the setting, the Salinas River. We're going to talk about Lennie Alone. We're going to talk about George and Lennie's final moments, and then the characters' responses at the end of the novel. Steinbeck takes us back to the Salinas River to end the novel as it began, with our two protagonists, George and Lennie, by the banks of that river. And there really seems to have been no progression for these characters. They were there at the beginning, they went to the ranch, they were hoping to build up a stake, they were hoping to get their dream come true by getting their own ranch, and yet here they are again, back by the river at the end, in far less hopeful circumstances. The description of the setting itself reveals Steinbeck's belief in the endless cyclicality of not only the natural environment, but also the animals that live within it. First of all, we've got the opening paragraph, which pretty much mirrors the opening paragraph of the whole novel. The daily cycle of sun and shadows just goes on and on. Nothing changes there. And also there's this idea that there's an endless cycle of animal violence, which is brilliantly symbolized in the episode with the water snake and the heron. There it is, the little water snake going upstream, presumably hoping to get somewhere, hoping to get some food, when suddenly it's lanced by the heron, a bigger predator. And this really represents one of the key ideas of the novel, which links to the title of the novel, Of Mice and Men, a title that comes from a line of a Robbie Burns poem, which we explored in another video, which you can see here. And it's that idea that no matter what plans an animal or a human makes, those plans will inevitably get destroyed by some greater force. And we see here this water snake going up the river when, boom, it gets destroyed by a more powerful, uncontrollable force. And that, of course, has happened throughout the novel. It's happened in chapter 3, Let's Get Our Dream Together, when, boom, there's the fight between Curly and Lennie. And then in chapter 4, Crook's hoping to be part of the dream, and boom, Curly's wife shuts him down. So we go through this cycle of hopes and then the destruction of hopes by violence. And we see that in the snake and the heron here. And it looks like there's going to be no change to that pattern. At the end of the description, there's another snake going up the pool, and the heron is waiting to lance it again. So Steinbeck implies that this cyclicality in the natural environment and in the violence of animals, and by implication humans, will never end. It's quite a hopeless idea. It's quite a Darwinistic idea. As often in this novel, there's a moment in which Steinbeck drops the tension before moving on to the really dramatic part. And he does that in this chapter when we get an insight into Lennie's head and we see what's there. Well, really these cartoonish figures. There's a giant Aunt Clara and there's a giant rabbit. They talk with Lennie's voice. When I read this section with students, they often think it's a bit weird and, why is it there? As I say, part of it is this way of dropping the tension and making us sweat it out before we get the really dramatic moment. But also I think there's another reason that this section is there. And it is really to show us the vividness and the power of Lennie's imagination. So first of all, what we see there are these figures that populate his imagination. There's the Aunt Clara figure, there's the rabbit figure. Aunt Clara is berating him for giving George nothing but trouble, and the rabbit is telling him he's never going to get to tend the rabbits. Now, clearly this is supposed to be Lennie's own head talking to him. It's fascinating that all he understands, as we've said in a number of videos, is getting told off by authority figures. He understands rewards and punishment, but not what's really morally right and morally wrong. And we see that again here very clearly. These figures are kind of these Freudian superego figures that pop into his mind and say, "You a bad boy, you've done the wrong thing." And he kind of understands the world in that way. But I think the most important reason that this is there is because it shows us just before the end exactly how vivid Lennie's imagination is. And that will be very important in a few minutes' time when George tells Lennie to imagine their dream ranch. When George appears, Lennie is ready for his telling off by his authority figure. And in fact, he kind of begs George to tell him off. "Ain't you going to give me hell like you always done before? Like, if I didn't have you, I'd take my $50. And then he wants the dream to be repeated. "Tell me like you done before." "Tell you what?" "About the other guys and about us. Guys like us got no family." And George steps into that role. He starts repeating this cyclical behaviour of Lennie doing something wrong, George getting angry, then George and Lennie coming together again over this idea of their friendship and the hope of being able to live off the fat of the land. George gets back into that rhythmical, cyclical conversation that they have. But this time, there's a difference. George is going to break the cycle, and he's clearly been preparing for that. He knows he has to carry out the mercy killing of Lennie. And the way Steinbeck interposes these short paragraphs where we can hear the lynch mob getting closer and closer, the shouts of the men getting closer and closer as they come hunting for Lennie, really shows how George has got to do this quite quickly if he wants to look after Lennie and kill Lennie before Lennie suffers a worse fate. So there's that real dramatic tension, because that lynch mob is really planning a slow, painful and horrifying death for Lennie, isn't it? Curly said he wants to shoot him in the guts to bend him over. You know, that's a nasty, slow way to die. So if they get to him, that's what's going to happen to him. George knows that, and he really doesn't want that end for his friend. In fact, what he has realised is the importance of a utilitarian philosophy. Now remember, utilitarianism is the philosophical standpoint that you need to perform actions based on the greatest good for the greatest number. And here, really, the greatest good for Lennie is for George to kill him in a merciful way rather than for the lynch mob to get him and kill him in a much more harmful and horrible way. So George knows this utilitarian decision has to be made. And George has also clearly got Candy's words echoing in his head. Remember how Candy admits to George that he wished he'd shot his own dog and not let a stranger do it. His dog was his friend. His dog was his responsibility, but he wasn't able to take that responsibility. And George remembers that. George wants to take the responsibility. And he also remembers what Carlson said about how to perform a mercy killing, which is to shoot the one you're going to kill right in the back of the head so that they don't feel any pain. And finally, he clearly knows his friend so well. He knows that if he tells Lennie to imagine their dream ranch, that dream ranch is going to really pop into Lennie's vivid imagination. And I think that's why Steinbeck showed us that section at the beginning of the chapter with Lennie vividly imagining Aunt Clara and the rabbit. It's to tell the reader, hey, look, this is a guy who, when he imagines something, it really comes to life. And George seems to know that about Lennie, because that's what George tells Lennie to think about when he's about to shoot him. So George puts all of that together. He understands the necessity of what he has to do. He understands how to stop it from being painful for Lennie, and he understands that he should be the one to do it. And he learns from Candy, and where Candy couldn't take responsibility, George does. But it isn't easy. At the moment at which he's about to shoot Lennie in the back of his head, his hand shook violently. That really reminds us of Slim's hand trembling. Do you remember when Slim gave the word for Carlson to shoot Candy's dog, and then Carlson took the dog outside and Slim was sitting there and he had to still one of his hands with the other hand. And the hands, the hands perform actions, and the trembling hands represent the responsibility and the feeling of guilt about performing that action. With Slim, and here too with George, the violent trembling of the hand is the difficulty of having to perform this act, having to take this moral decision, this utilitarian decision. And Steinbeck is really showing us that those who take these kinds of decisions suffer for it. The Slims of this world, the Georges of this world, they don't take these decisions lightly. They suffer because they understand the full emotional implications of what they're doing in the moment of performing the actions. And this, I believe, is Steinbeck's message to us. What does it take to be a real hero? It takes the power, the willpower to take a difficult, responsible decision and to carry it out. That's what elevates George way above Candy, who wasn't able to perform the thing he should have done with his dog, and really elevates him to Slim's level. George becomes a hero through this action in this dark world, in this miserable time of the American Depression. The heroes are the ones who can take the hardest decisions and live with them despite the physical pain. And Lennie, well, because of his vivid imagination, we could say that he perhaps even achieves the dream in the moment of death. George has told him to look off down the river and to visualise the dream ranch. And at the moment of his death, when he's shot in the back of his head, he is visualising that ranch, and we know he visualises things in great detail. So in some sense, his moment of death is a moment of transcendence to the ranch. He kind of achieves his dream in death. It's interestingly paralleled with the death of Curly's wife. She achieves some kind of peace in her moment of death, and Lennie, in his moment of death, achieves some kind of fulfillment as well. Again, Steinbeck's message seems to be to us that for some of these marginalised characters, death is the best option during the Great Depression. Now, moments after the Mercy killing, the other characters burst into the clearing, and the novel ends with this fascinating pairing of George and Slim contrasted with Curly and Carlson. That's what Steinbeck wants to leave us with. So Slim comes in, he's immediately supportive, he's right there for George, as we would hope, as we would expect from Slim. And when he says a guy got to sometimes, he's really verbalising the necessity of taking these difficult utilitarian decisions. And then right in the final lines of the novel, he actually helps George up. He twitches George's elbow. We talked in the novel about how there isn't really very much caring, compassionate touching going on in the novel. Most touch is violent in this novel, but right at the end here, Slim gives another example of the rare instances of physically helping for someone in a caring and positive way. Steinbeck also shows here Slim being the leader. George has had to lead with Lennie all the way through the novel. It's been a real drain on his energy. We've seen that right from chapter 1. And finally, he is disburdened of this weight of responsibility of leading Lennie. At last, Slim leads him. It seems to be George's reward for performing this heroic action. In the final sentences, Slim led George into the entrance of the trail and up toward the highway. The word up implies elevation to a higher level, perhaps a more moral or spiritual level. The highway is a location which has not appeared in the cyclical, repetitive world of the novel. Highway implies movement and the potential for real change. And we can see that this friendship that has been forming between them since they first met really has the potential for a deep and meaningful companionship of equals, really, in a way that George and Lennie's companionship was never going to be. Notice that they are not going to go off and achieve the American dream. They're not going to go and get a ranch. What are they going to do? They're going to go and get a drink, which is the habitual entertainment for migrant workers. Steinbeck seems to be saying to us very clearly here, forget those dreams. They are just fantasies. What you really need to start doing is being compassionate and caring for those who are around you right now and who need your support. That's his message here. This is the realistic way of dealing with the difficulties of life in the Great Depression. Stop fantasizing, be with your friends, get a drink, it'll be okay. So, Steinbeck is showing us at the last that there is hope for change through a meaningful companionship despite everything. Who's left behind? Curly and Carlson. And they really just don't understand what's going on, do they? The final words of the novel are from Carlson as he turns to Curly and says, "Now what the hell you suppose is eating them two guys?" I mean, they don't have a clue, do they? They don't understand. They don't have the compassion or the empathy to understand what George has been through and is currently going through, having shot his best friend. They just don't get it. They are left behind in the clearing while the heroic characters Slim and George move on up to an elevated plane, a more moral, a more spiritual plane. And Steinbeck leaves it to the reader to decide in which of these pairings does the reader really want to be. Do you want to be a Curly or a Carlson figure, or do you want to be a Slim or a George figure? The answer is obvious. Be a Slim, be a George, take responsibility, be compassionate, take care of those around you in need. Those are the messages at the end of the novel. I hope you enjoyed this series on Of Mice and Men. I certainly enjoyed making it. Give me a like and subscribe to my channel so that you can find out when I start posting videos for my next series.